If I were to go into your neighborhood that has the HOA and I were to just start mowing everyone's lawn, and then I leave a bill on everybody's door, I say it's going to cost them $100. And I don't actually have a valid claim of property over any of these people's land. I'm just going there and I'm rendering a service that they never asked for.
Earlier today, we did a thing you might have heard about called Change My Mind, except here at Anarchapulco, it was kind of hard to find people that wanted to change our mind on the fact that taxation is theft. So I went undercover as Statist Patrick to allow people to test their arguments and to sharpen their wit on me.
The arbiter of truth and all that is holy.
All right, I'm Patrick Smith. Thanks for sitting down. What's your name?
Chris Chu.
Chris Chu, good to meet you. So what we're doing here today is we're sitting in the midst of a large group of people that would very much disagree with the position that taxation is not theft. And so I want to give all these people an opportunity to sit down with me and try and rationalize that position. And, you know, maybe we have a good conversation and both of us might learn something. So thanks for having this conversation.
Yeah, you bet. It's more than happy to talk about it.
All right, so my position is quite simply that for this discussion, taxation is not theft. Change my mind.
Sure. Well, I need to make sure I understand. I need to make sure I understand your position. So, when you say it's not theft, what do you mean by theft exactly?
Well, we have laws that define theft as, taking something from somebody, probably without their permission, right?
Okay. Yeah. So I define theft as taking anything from someone else without their consent. I don't necessarily I don't at all go by what the law says. It's just kind of a common term. So if we can agree on that term, theft is...
Well, why aren't the laws important, though?
Well, the laws are really just somebody's opinion written down on paper.
The laws are like all of our opinions, sort of consolidated and combined into one definition of theft, so that we all don't have different definitions of theft that get enforced unfairly or differently from person to person or event to event.
Well, unfortunately, with those laws, they are not universally applicable to everyone. For example, if I were to attempt to tax the government, I would be facing severe consequences for doing so, as opposed to the government were to tax me, and they get away just fine with it. So I think there's kind of a fundamental flaw in allowing the government to define theft differently for itself than for people like myself.
Well, the government doesn't steal.
Okay. By steal, do you mean the government does not take property from me without my consent? Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. I don't consent to it.
You do consent to it by living here in the area. Well, not here, this is Mexico, but by choosing to live in the area that you do, which you certainly have the ability to leave. I mean, you could certainly you could live here in Mexico where the taxes are much lower and in some cases and in some industries non-existent. So how is that not consensual?
Well, I mean, it really kind of boils down to property rights. There are cases where you could make that argument, and I would say that's a valid argument. For example, if this resort we're in were to say, by staying in this resort, you must abide by specific rules. If you don't abide by them, then you must leave. If one of those rules were that I must pay a fee, daily fee or something like that, something akin to what the government does with taxation, and that fee would be for some services rendered or something, that would be valid because there is someone who actually has a just claim of ownership over this facility. Whereas with the state, they request or...
Well, I was just going to agree with you. Just the state is kind of the same thing as a giant HOA that, by living in that area or living in that neighborhood, you agree to pay your annual HOA dues that then get used for shared services like the swimming pool and the workout center.
Okay. Okay, so there's an assumption of a valid claim of property ownership over this resort or in an HOA, for example. A lot of HOAs, you see a developer would acquire some unused land, and they would then take out bulldozers and they would develop that land. They would build roads, they would build homes and things of that nature. And then it would be up to potential customers to come and purchase a home in that neighborhood. and they would have the option upon entering into an agreement to purchase a home they could accept the agreement or not to be a part of the homeowners association. In my neighborhood, I was not able to purchase my home without agreeing to the HOA. And all of this is valid because it doesn't involve acquisition of property from someone against their consent. With the state, certainly they do render certain services to people.
Well, they did almost exactly what you just said the HOA would do. They built the roads that you use, right, that you benefit from.
So with the state, they don't acquire any wealth voluntarily. Let's think about how...
well, that's kind of the issue. That's a fallacy of... that's begging the question, actually, right? The topic of the debate is whether or not that's considered theft. And you just stated that like that's the conclusion. But that's what we're debating. It's not theft. They didn't... my position is that they're not using stolen resources for this stuff.
Okay. Could you elaborate on that then? Why is it... you're saying they're not using stolen resources. What are the reasons that you don't think... well, here, let me ask you this. Do you think that taxes are acquired voluntarily?
Yes.
Okay. So if you...
In the same way HOA dues are acquired voluntarily.
Okay, so you have the option to opt out of taxes.
Yeah, I could leave the HOA. I could buy property elsewhere.
Okay.
And with full foreknowledge of the rules of the area that I choose to move into. Exact same thing for a country. If you bought a house in the U.S., you had full foreknowledge of the rules in place there, so you can't say that it's somehow theft when they come asking for their annual HOA dues.
Okay, so I think we agreed that there is some valid claim of ownership that the developer had when he was selling the plots of land in the neighborhood. Could you describe for me the claim of ownership that the state has? What is that based upon?
Why wouldn't a group of people working together as a government be able to claim land like a group of people working together privately could?
Like there's people that call themselves government. Why can't they work together to do that?
Well, yeah, like there's a board of directors for the HOA that work together to jointly manage the shared property that isn't owned by any one homeowner in the HOA area.
Well, I mean, certainly if these individuals are using their own funds to develop property, and if they want to call themselves government and they want to work together to do that, they have every right to do that.
Maybe I did a bad job at making the analogy. So in my HOA, the tennis court and the swimming pool, we all have a share of ownership. So it's not like there's a separate entity or a separate group of people that aren't members of the HOA that own this stuff. It's that we all it's public property. We all jointly own the roads and the public parks and the national parks. So it's not like they have some ownership that we don't. It's just that we all have a share, like a share in a company. You know, if you have a board of directors, they all own. You have a bunch of shareholders, and they all vote several times a year on the directions they think the company should go.
Okay, so are you suggesting that I have a claim of ownership over? You said we jointly own this. We, as in you and I, and anyone who uses it, or
if you're a voting citizen, you could be thought of as having a share of ownership over all the public property.
Okay, so I would have.
Are you a citizen of the U.S.? You don't have to answer that.
I'm told I am.
Fair enough. So that citizenship entitles you to a share of control over the jointly owned resources, just like you'd have if you bought shares in a company or bought a house in an HOA. Every house gets one vote in how the joint property is controlled.
That's not my understanding of property. My understanding of property is it's something that if I possess it, then I alone get to utilize that thing. I get to exclude people from it and determine and to come up with the terms under which it can be used. With the state acquires property more or less through force, eminent domain, or just they straight up decree it. They would say, take the Louisiana Purchase, for example. It was a vast, vast, vast sum of land that was purchased with money. That money was, for starters, the government was broke. It didn't have any money. It was broke in the sense that it used money that it took from someone else. Everything the government uses to purchase something was first taken from someone else. And if that person refused to give the money to them, they were under the threat of force. Today, when you don't pay your taxes or when you don't when you resist them taking them from you. You face future wage garnishment. You can be imprisoned.
Just like with my home in the HOA, if I refuse to pay my dues, they put a lien on my house. And that's perfectly fine. That's not theft.
Okay, so again, with an HOA, you do enter into a voluntary agreement. With the state, you're never presented with terms to accept. I never had anything in front of me that I could review and say, okay, I see these are the terms. I accept or I don't accept. Even if I did have those terms presented to me, I would be in an interesting position, because if I were to refuse those terms, I would face a retaliation. You had mentioned I can leave to another country. That is another way of telling me that I am not free to be here in this particular location, and that I must move, which it's a really big deal, because this is extremely expensive. If I were to even attempt to do that, I would have to pay several $100s just to fill out the paperwork. They may not even permit me to leave, and I believe the cost is actually several $1,000s all said and done.
So I'd like to back up, because we kind of blew past something that I thought was important that you said. Earlier, you mentioned that that's not how property works when I was discussing joint ownership in like a corporation or in the joint property of an HOA. Are you sure that that's not how property works? Like, I can't have a corporation with several partners jointly owning the assets of the corporation? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's accepted property norm, right?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I partner with people to start businesses, and we all each agree by putting in certain amounts of resources, or just by agreeing for sweat equity, let's say, to own a percentage of the joint resources of the company. So if the company has an asset in its computer equipment, or if the company makes profit and that goes into the bank account, that bank account and those assets are jointly owned explicitly by the people that own the company. What's wrong with that method of property ownership? Why am I not? Who is to say that I'm not allowed to jointly own property with other people?
Oh no, that was not what I meant to say. Okay. So what I was getting at there, I don't remember exactly what I said before, but if you're referring to can individuals get together and jointly own property, certainly they can. However, in this case, the assets we're talking about are something other than what that company owns. We're actually talking about my assets, and so I have not agreed to be a part of this corporation. I've not been presented with the terms or an offer.
But I mean, you were, right? Because like all of the laws are public. There's entire law libraries that are freely searchable. It's like law.us.gov or something. You know exactly what you're getting into when you move into this country. And to say that you don't know the rules when you buy a house here, when you buy property, I'm talking about here, this is Mexico, when you buy a house in the States, you can't say you're ignorant of the rules of that. They're public. It's public. It's all public knowledge. And not only that, but you get a participatory role in what those rules are, just like you would in an HOA or the board of directors or a company. So not only do you have the knowledge when you buy that property, you can't say you're ignorant, but you also have a say.
Okay. Could you help me to understand then in this, with regard to the state and their acquisition of this property, that you're saying they get to make the rules for, and I can view the rules and all of that. Could you help me understand exactly what is that based on, their claim of ownership in the first place? Because if you were to build, we're in this hotel here, if you were to build a giant hotel like this on what was previously unowned, and make the rules, that would be one thing. I'm just having trouble understanding this claim of ownership that the state has, that they're saying they're acting like because I am here in this, 320 million square mile plot of land. I think it's something like that. I think it's like 300 million square miles or something of land, and they claim that they own it. I mean, I could do that. I could say I own all of Mexico. I'm here I am, agree to these. But I don't think it's not really a good basis just to decree it. So what exactly is it that you say? Because I understand people can vote, certainly, but I don't understand what's the claim itself based on, that anyone, even the people voting, they claim that they have if they imagine that they have the right to vote and to somehow make decisions as if they were property owners. Okay, where did they think they had that valid claim of ownership over all that land?
Well, I think that joint ownership is only for the public stuff, right? The public roads, public buildings, public parks, national parks, things like that.
It almost seems like a contradiction to say public parks being public property. Again, property is the right to exclude. If it's public, though, and it's open to the public, you're not excluding.
Well, we exclude like non-citizens and people from other countries, right? Build a wall.
I don't exclude people like that. If I had a valid claim, then sure. Like if it's my home, I can prove I did it because I acquired my home through a voluntary exchange of value. I offered the fruits of my labor in exchange for this home that was already built. Someone else had built it. It was an agreement that we both agreed upon. It was me and a bank. And so I'm just not really understanding the state's claim. I still don't understand why is it that you would say that they own the place. I mean, I understand they say it, and I certainly am aware that they say they own it, but it really just sounds like a decree. We own it. You're going to do as we say. If I don't do as you say, I face punishment and retaliation. And in the case of taxation, this is just one other instance where they say, you do as we say, in this case, give us your property, or you're going to face punishment or retaliation. You cannot consent under duress in that way.
Do you own a house?
Yes.
Were you forced with at gunpoint to buy that house?
No.
Were you aware of the rules and the laws of the land in the area where you bought your house?
Yes, and I was aware that the person previously had a valid claim of ownership over that which they sold me. And I was aware. I was fully aware. We went over all of the contract. I was presented with each one. I initialed each page to show that I did fully understand everything in the contract. And at the end, I signed the contract knowing that the person I was acquiring this land from did have a valid claim of ownership. These were the terms under purchasing it. One of them was to have a $200 a year fee and to abide by the homeowner association fees. All of these things, I came in and I was given the option to opt in or opt out. The biggest part here being someone did already have a valid claim of ownership over that land. And it almost seems like we're presupposing that the state does have that claim, and I would challenge that. I would.
Did the bill of sale include terms saying that any disputes will be adjudicated in XYZ court and under XYZ jurisdiction?
It's been a couple of years. I don't think it did specify that, though, that I can recall.
I would be surprised if it didn't specify a jurisdiction for disputes. I think it's pretty standard. But nevertheless, I would still argue that you knew what you were getting into. You can't say that you were ignorant to the fact that there was laws in that area governing the activity. And you're asking about the origin of sort of where this government came from. I think I'm sure it's different in certain areas, but I think by and large, individual people back in the Wild West, homesteaded their property and then voluntarily chose to incorporate their property into the local government at the time to gain the benefit of the shared resources, the law protection, the judicial framework, the common areas or whatnot. That was a voluntary thing that they consented to with their property back in the day when they incorporated their property into the town. And then, somebody bought the property from them, and somebody from them, and somebody from them, and somebody from them, and here we are 300 years later, and you just bought your house. Well, that was a long chain that began with consent to incorporate that property into the government. So again, there's no break of consent here. You're one in a long line of people that agreed to that.
Okay. I'm not quite sure. So I'm not familiar with this part of history where all of these people consented to merge their land in with state-controlled services. It sounds like you named off several services that they agreed to pay for.
I'm not a Wild West expert. What I do know from what little history in the time that I know is that the judicial services were something that they wanted, right? They didn't want to be like the Black Flag anarchy zone where somebody could come kill their family for whatever. So that they got law enforcement. They got. I'm not sure what other services would have been back there. Probably access to the town, the I guess main roads or something like that. What I would have to look. I would have to do my research on history. Yeah. So, do you agree about those services were probably ones that Why do you think they incorporated their property? Or do you think they didn't incorporate their property?
I don't know. I don't know that part of history, but I would not doubt that there were probably some individuals who own property who maybe were on board with receiving state-provided services of some kind, and they may have been okay with that. Certainly, I guess, I doubt that everyone was down for that, and not to mention it was kind of, assuming we're talking about, like, let's take Texas, for example. In Texas, there's a lot of disputed lands in that case, and a lot of this acquisition of property was more akin to like a gang's claim over a territory. They say this is our territory, and you will do as we say. If you don't, we will slaughter you. And this is kind of what happened.
Can I hit pause? Because I think we have gone way down a very minutia detailed road that I would like to offer a suggestion if this ever happens to you again. Do you mind if I offer you that suggestion? So when people start likening government to HOAs, the easy way to break a brain out of that argument is to say, okay, yeah, sure, you voluntarily agreed to a set of rules governing your HOA and governing the property in the HOA. And yeah, you're voluntarily bound to behave accordingly. What about how they change the rules? Are they allowed to change the rules? Did you agree to a system of how they could change those rules? Yeah, you typically do. There's a board process, there's votes and all this stuff. And so they can, not only can they make rules for how your property is controlled, but there's also a system where they can change the rules about how your property is controlled. What's most often ignored when you make this association between an HOA and a government is the unlimited degree to which a government changes and has changed and can change its rules compared to how an HOA is typically thought of being able to change its rules. So, like, an HOA might change the percentage of homeowners necessary to change a rule, or they might tweak the dues by 5% a year. But what is to stop your HOA? This is the question. What is to stop your HOA from outvoting you and changing the rule to say, if you're a month late on your dues, we get to kill you? What is to stop the government from making that rule? Did you agree? So even if you agreed to a set of rules that would allow them to make that rule, do you honestly think that you consented to them being able to make rules involving killing you? Because the government does. HOAs don't. That's a big difference. The government is life and death after a certain point. HOAs are bushes, shrubs, and community pools. That's one thing I usually say, just to point out that, hey, this is kind of a disanalogy land. Let's find a better analogy for what's happening.
Yeah, I know we definitely got off target there a little bit. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I still really think it comes down to the claim. People say they claim they own it, and I would say, okay, prove that you own it. And in my mind, you can acquire ownership through voluntary exchange or through homesteading something. And in the case of the state, it's more akin to, they don't really homestead what they claim. They say, we're going to take this massive region here, and we're going to claim it, and it contains many people's property. And then we're going to provide X number of services, and maybe several of them do want those services and are okay with it. However, the issue here, or what I see it as more akin to, is if I were to go into your neighborhood that has the HOA, and I were to just start mowing everyone's lawn because it's more efficient. I want to get more customers, and I'm just going to be able to take my lawnmower all the way down the street and one line, next line, knock them all out really quick, and I can get a whole bunch of yards done that way. And then I leave a bill on everybody's door. I say it's going to cost them $100. Let's say the going rate is $50, whatever. And so people aren't really happy with that. Some might say, oh, great, I benefited from it. But in this case, I'm not actually homesteading the land. I don't actually have a valid claim of property over any of these people's land. I'm just going there and I'm rendering a service that they never asked for. Certainly, they could even raise a case and demand restitution for what I've done for trespassing and altering their property. And I think that's more a better analogy for what the state does is it forces its services on people, and some people like it, some people don't, but it never really asks for consent. They never come to the homeowner first and say, are you, as an individual who owns this home, do you consent to this fee? In my town, I'm from Fayetteville, Arkansas, and in Fayetteville, our taxes went up by a couple $100s, and a big part of that was a multi-million-dollar expansion to the public libraries. I prefer to have physical copies of books, but I don't go to the library for it. I like to own the books that I have, so I purchase them online, or I go to a local bookstore, something of that nature. I don't need a library, and I certainly don't want to pay over $100 for an expansion on that library. So I was never asked myself, as the owner of my property, do I consent? Instead, a bunch of other people who are not me got together. In theory, they got together and voted. I don't think that's actually what it is. Probably just some politicians who had been elected voted for this, and they said, okay, the point being, I'm the one who owns my land, not all these other individuals. And so they can vote all they want, and it may even come back and result in me having to pay under threat.
One last counter argument that I think would be helpful for you in this analogy is disconsent, withdrawal of consent. So even like taking my analogy of the Wild West, I choose to incorporate my land for the purposes of getting access to shared resources or shared services. I must, as a property owner, have an unequivocal, infinite time, like time is not an issue, right to withdraw that consent, to disincorporate. And if I don't, then someone has stolen my property from me. So just that, and that is a break in modern HOAs. Like, I do not have the right to disassociate my house from the HOA for any reason, much less them changing the rules to something I don't want. That is unethical, and I don't really believe that you have the ability to sign a contract that nullifies your consent for the rest of time. But that would be another discussion. Sure. Thanks for sitting down with me today. I enjoyed it very much. Appreciate it.
Now, we all know that this takes time, which we all know is money. And to buy all the equipment costs money, which we all know is money. So basically, the Disenthrall channel has been money squared in input from us. So if you want to do your part and take the load off of our shoulders, consider going to patreon.com/disenthrall to donate.